History often, and maybe for good reason, tries to sort of sweep certain names under the rug. But today we're taking a hard look at figures who essentially turned cruelty into a craft. People whose actions, well, they really push the absolute limits of human behavior. It's definitely a challenging topic, but if you want to understand the mechanisms behind extreme violence, you really have to look past just the names. You need to focus on the cold, hard facts, the systems they served, or even the ones they built themselves.
Exactly. And that's our mission for this deep dive. We're working from sources that provide a kind of classification, looking at 4 figures known for very distinct types of cruelty. We're talking state-sponsored, ideological, chaotic, and even deeply personal individual cruelty. The goal isn't just to list their worst crimes, though we'll cover that. It's understanding the crucial context. How did they actually gain influence? And, importantly, what structural supports allowed their actions to happen, even flourish?
Right, so the big question we're tackling is, what's the connection here? What's the common DNA? Because we're looking at people operating in completely different eras, different political systems, from a highly bureaucratic state executioner on one end to a pathological individual offender on the other. Let's try and unpack this dark history.
Okay, let's start where organization meets atrocity, the cold, efficient machinery of the state.
First on the list is Vasel Blin. Now, he's a name most history books just skip over. His notoriety wasn't built on charisma or political maneuvering, really, but on sheer, almost terrifying competence within a system.
That's right. Blin was, effectively, Stalin's chief executioner. He joined the NKVD, the Soviet secret police, quite early, back in 1921. And within just 6 years, he was leading a specialized execution branch. What's really fascinating and deeply disturbing is how he got there and stayed there. The sources highlight his terrifying calm, his military skill, yes, but mostly his absolute devotion to orders. This obedience, this efficiency, it was his shield. He survived purge after purge that took down other high-ranking officials. Why? Because he was just too good at his job, too compliant to be easily replaced. He made himself invaluable to the system.
That's a chilling insight the source material really pushes. He didn't just do violence, he perfected administrative murder. But how does that level of, repetitive killing become normalized for someone? Was he just seen as a tool? Or did that kind of detached compliance actually get rewarded within Stalin's system?
Oh, highly rewarded and definitely insulated. The sources are pretty clear on that. His sheer efficiency made him the perfect cog in that terrible machine. His connection isn't just general. He's directly linked to supervising the Katyn Forest massacre operations. We're talking late 1930s, early 1940s. The methodical execution of around 22,000 Polish intelligentsia, officers, teachers, engineers, executed across multiple sites. The method itself was described, chillingly, as an assembly line for murder.
An assembly line. And the scale linked to Blin personally just reinforces that industrial, almost inhuman approach. Some sources estimate he personally executed thousands. There are claims, maybe harder to verify, but out there, of up to 7,000 people in just 28 days. That's hundreds a day. So the key takeaway for Blin is this chilled out violence disguised as duty. The absolute horror of administrative obedience.
Precisely. So if Blin represents the horror of that kind of systematic obedience, let's shift gears. Let's look at what happens when absolute ideology doesn't just use the system, but essentially replaces it. Let's talk about Ante Pavelić. Here we move from that cold mechanical compliance to the terrifying heat of ideological fanaticism.
Okay, Pavelić. He was a Croatian hardliner who really came onto the scene during the instability after World War I. When the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes became Yugoslavia and King Alexander started cracking down on political dissent, Pavelić fled. He ended up regrouping in Italy, and that's where he formed the Ustasha movement.
Right, and his big opportunity, his moment to seize power, came during World War II. With Nazi German backing, he established this brutal puppet state in Croatia. And we need to be really clear about who the Ustasha were. They weren't just nationalists. They were a fascist, ultra-nationalist, and importantly, a Catholic fundamentalist paramilitary group. That ideological mix explains the sheer extremity of their cruelty. Almost immediately, they set up concentration camps. Their main targets were Serbs, but also Jews, Romani people, and any political opponents, really.
And the sources point to something particularly barbaric here, something that just makes your blood run cold. This regime established concentration camps specifically for children.
Yes, it's almost incomprehensible. It speaks directly to the ultimate goal of their particular fascist vision, which was the complete eradication of groups they saw as ethnically or religiously impure. The numbers are debated, as they often are, but reliable estimates indicate hundreds of thousands were killed, displaced, or forcibly converted under his rule. And Pavelić, Like many others involved in such regimes, he managed to escape after the war, lived out his years in exile, Argentina, then Spain. But the damage caused by that collaborationist state was, well, irreversible.
So we've seen violence as cold bureaucracy with Blin and violence driven by burning ideology with Pavelić. Now let's pivot again. Let's look at the kind of terror that emerges when the state itself descends into chaos and unpredictability. I'm talking about Idi Amin in Uganda. This is post-colonial rule collapsing into, essentially, despotism.
Amin's story is quite different. He rose through the ranks of the British colonial army, the King's African Rifles. Then in 1971, he seized power in Uganda through a military coup. And interestingly, initially, he was actually cheered by many Ugandans, seen as a strong man who could bring change. But that initial optimism faded very, very quickly. His rule rapidly descended into this reign of terror. It was characterized by public brutality, killings carried out by the military, and completely unpredictable purges. You never knew who was next.
And his targets were so broad, almost arbitrary at times, which is part of what made the regime so terrifying, right? Political opponents, sure, but also artists, journalists, judges, specific ethnic groups like the Akoli and Lango. And then there was the mass expulsion of Uganda's Asian minority, mostly business owners. That decision alone triggered the country's total economic collapse.
Absolutely. The economic fallout was devastating alongside the human cost. Human rights groups estimate somewhere between 300,000 and maybe even 500,000 deaths are attributable to his regime. I think the key difference between Amin and someone like Blin or Pavelić is the nature of the terror. Amin's violence felt chaotic, often driven by sudden whims, paranoia, even spectacle. It wasn't necessarily systematic in the same way. Eventually, he was overthrown in 1979. He lived out his later years in exile in Saudi Arabia, leaving behind a nation that was deeply traumatized and impoverished.
Okay, so we've covered systemic state violence, ideological state violence, and chaotic state terror. But sometimes the most horrifying cruelty exists entirely outside the state framework. It manifests as a pure individual pathology. So we have to turn now to Luis Garavito.
Luis Garavito, yes. Known in Colombia as La Bestia, the Beast. His crimes weren't state-sponsored. They were a horrifying spree spanning the 1980s and especially the 1990s. He was finally arrested in 1999, largely because authorities started discovering these awful mass graves of children in 1998. He ultimately confessed to murdering well over 100 children, mostly boys. Investigations linked him to potentially closer to 200 victims across Colombia.
And the sources describe his background as this ugly combination of abuse, addiction, and obsession. What really stands out here is that he wasn't operating under orders or ideology or any state cover. This was different. The sources even mention that he apparently sought help at times, talked to priests, psychiatrists, but the compulsions, the crimes, they just continued and escalated.
That's right. He was sentenced to decades in prison. There was some controversy because, due to his cooperation with authorities finding bodies, and also some aspects of Colombian sentencing laws at the time, his effective sentence was significantly reduced. Though it should be said, he did die in prison from illness in the early 2020s. He really represents that fourth face of cruelty we're examining, the isolated, pathological individual. Proof that immense, incalculable pain doesn't always need the machinery of the state behind it.
Okay, let's try to bring this together. It's a difficult comparison, but we have the obedient bureaucrat, Blin, the fascist ideologue, Pavelić, the chaotic despot, Amin, and the lone pathological killer, Garavito. They operated across different centuries, different continents, different contexts entirely. What is the crucial shared DNA here? What connects them, according to the sources?
Well, the sources seem to converge on a few key points, and they really highlight structural and psychological factors, and maybe three crucial moments or types of failure.
Okay, walk us through those. How do these points unify such, well, vastly different kinds of criminal action?
Right, so the first point is what you could call the architecture of compliance, or maybe enablement. Systems don't just passively allow cruelty. Sometimes they actively reward removing moral friction. Think about Blin. His efficiency wasn't just tolerated, it was a bureaucratic virtue. The state structure itself, whether it's Stalin's NKVD or the Ustash's concentration camps, can provide this sort of administrative distance. It makes it possible to commit mass murder without feeling, perhaps, direct personal responsibility in the same way.
Okay, so the system itself facilitates it. What's the second point?
The second focuses more on the individual's choice within that system, or outside it. Let's call it the trading of reality, or maybe empathy. This is that moment when an individual decides that the hierarchy, whether it's bureaucratic like Blin's, ideological like Pavelić's, or just the pursuit of personal power like Amin's, is more real, more valuable than the actual human being standing in front of them. Blin chose duty over empathy. Pavelić chose his fascist ideology. Amin chose absolute power. Garavito perhaps traded others' lives for his own compulsions. In each case, there's a fundamental trade-off. Empathy is discarded for something else perceived as more important: obedience, ideology, power, or obsession.
That makes sense. Trading empathy for something else.
And the third theme identified is the critical failure point that allows the horror to actually take root and persist. Societal collapse, or maybe societal silence. Whether it's the pervasive fear that paralyzed Soviet society under Stalin, allowing Blin's work to continue, or the global chaos of World War II that provided cover for Pavelić, or the institutional collapse and international complexities that allowed Amin's regime to last for years. Or even in Garavito's case, perhaps societal blind spots or failures in child protection that allowed him to operate for so long. The common thread is that wider systems or communities, or even the international community, failed to intervene effectively until the damage was, frankly, irreversible.
That's a powerful synthesis. It really shifts the focus from just the monster to the environment that allows the monster to thrive. It's tough, though. Does the source material suggest any difference in how society recovers from, say, state terror versus the horror of an individual like Garavito? Because statistically, state terror kills far more people.
That's a complex question. While state terror obviously impacts the entire foundation of a nation, its institutions, its economy, the sources sometimes touch on the difference in trust. State terror, like what Pavelić or Blin were part of, forces citizens to fundamentally distrust authority, sometimes for generations. It breaks the social contract from the top down. Individual terror, like Garavito's, causes immense, localized, deeply personal trauma, absolutely devastating for the families and communities directly affected. But it doesn't necessarily dismantle the overall trust in societal structures in quite the same widespread way, though it certainly exposes failures within them.
So understanding these figures really requires looking beyond the individuals, as horrific as they were, to the enabling structures, the bureaucracy, the ideology, the political chaos, and, crucially, those societal blind spots or moments of inaction.
Exactly. And perhaps that leaves you, the listener, with an important question to consider. What is the moral difference, if any, between that chilled-out violence disguised as duty, the kind we saw with Blin, versus the chaotic, arguably self-serving violence of someone like Idi Amin? What do those distinctions tell us about the nature of evil itself? Is it different when it's driven by a desire to meticulously uphold a terrible system versus when it seems driven by pure personal whim and paranoia?
Yeah, and maybe reflect too on that distinction between state failure where authority collapses and figures like Amin or even Pavelić seize power in the vacuum, versus systemic state complicity where the system itself, the one Blin serves so efficiently, is meticulously designed for methodical murder. That shift in responsibility from chaotic takeover to deliberate bureaucratic design, well, it tells us a lot about the potential dangers and fragility within our own institutions, doesn't it? Something to think about.